I still remember the exact shade of blue on that October morning, not because I'm sentimental, but because my brain decided to file it away like evidence. The sky was that pale, washed-out kind of blue you only get when autumn is finally winning against summer. I was standing in my kitchen in our house in Fairfax, Virginia, staring at a crack in the tile floor that had been there for 5 years, wondering why I'd never bothered to fix it. My coffee was getting cold, the dog was whining at the back door, and my husband, Mark, was upstairs shaving, the buzz of his electric razor humming through the ceiling like a trapped bee. It was a Tuesday, completely ordinary, unremarkable in every possible way. And that was the cruelest part of it all, because when you look back on the day that shatters your entire life, you expect it to have been dramatic from the start. You expect thunderclouds, a spilled glass of milk, a premonition. But it was just another Tuesday, and I was just another wife, thinking about tile grout and grocery lists. Mark and I had been married for 12 years, together for 15. We met in college at the University of Maryland, back when he wore cargo shorts and played bass in a cover band that was terrible but endearing. I fell for him because he made me laugh harder than anyone I'd ever met. He had this way of looking at the world like it was all one big inside joke, and he was just waiting for me to get the punchline. We built a life together the way you're supposed to. We bought a house with a backyard that was too big for just the two of us, so we filled it with a rescue dog named Otis and a grill Mark used exactly 3 times a year. We had careers that were respectable but not glamorous. I was a project manager for a mid-sized tech firm, which sounds more impressive than it is. Most of my day was spent in Excel spreadsheets and conference calls where someone always forgot to mute themselves.
Mark was a high school history teacher at the local public school. He loved it. The kids loved him. He'd come home with stories about teenage stupidity and graded essays on the couch while we watched whatever true crime documentary I'd picked out that week. It was stable. It was comfortable. It was the kind of life people write greeting cards about, but not the kind anyone makes a movie out of. And I was okay with that. I was more than okay with it. I was proud of it. We didn't have kids. That was a decision we made together after a few years of trying and too many doctor's appointments that ended with sympathetic smiles and vague medical jargon. There were tears, of course. There was a period where I couldn't look at a baby stroller without feeling like someone had punched me in the chest. But eventually, we found our way through it. We told ourselves we were a complete family anyway. Just us and Otis and our mismatched collection of IKEA furniture. We traveled when we could. We had date nights at that Italian place on Main Street, where the owner always remembered our order. We built a life that was small but full. At least I thought it was full. I thought we were happy. I thought we were solid. That's the thing about betrayal, though. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock on the front door with a fedora and a confession. It grows in the spaces you don't look at. It hides in the late nights at work, the phone turned face down on the table, the sudden interest in a hobby that requires being away from home. Looking back, I can see the breadcrumbs now. The way Mark started going to the gym at 6 a.m, even though he'd always been a night owl. The way he'd mention a colleague named Kate in casual conversation, always with just enough detail to seem harmless. Oh, Kate from the English department had a funny take on that. Kate recommended this podcast. Kate's going through a divorce. It's really sad. I never thought twice about it. Why would I?
I trusted him. I trusted him with my entire being. The way you trust the floor beneath your feet. You don't question it until it falls away. And when it falls away, you don't even have the language to describe what's happening to you. You just feel the air rush past as you plummet. The morning it all started to surface, Mark was still in the shower when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. Usually I ignore those. Spam, wrong numbers, political polls. But this one didn't have a preview blocked. The first few words flashed across my screen, and I read them without thinking. I read them the way you read a headline you don't understand yet. Your wife deserves to know. That was it. Just those 4 words. I stared at the screen for a long moment, waiting for the rest of the message to load. But that was it. The whole thing. A minute later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo, a screenshot of a text thread between Mark and an unsaved number. The name at the top said Kate. I knew the name, of course. I knew it from the gym stories and the podcast recommendations and the casual mentions that had floated through our dinner conversations for the last 6 months. But seeing it on my screen in black and white made my stomach drop in a way I can't fully explain. It was the difference between knowing a storm is out at sea and watching it make landfall. The texts were dated from the past 3 weeks. I scrolled through them in the kitchen, my coffee growing colder by the second, my hands starting to shake. They were harmless at first, work stuff, lunch plans, a joke about a staff meeting, but then it shifted. The tone changed. There were emojis I'd never seen Mark use, little hearts and winks and a sunset emoji that made my skin crawl. I miss your voice. That was one. I can't stop thinking about Saturday. That was another. Saturday.
3 Saturdays ago, Mark told me he was going to a faculty retreat at a lake house 2 hours away. He'd packed a bag, he'd kissed me goodbye. I told him to have fun and send pictures. He sent pictures. I remember them. A sunset over the water, a group shot with his colleagues, all of them smiling, all of them clueless. He looked happy. I thought it was the fresh air. I thought it was the break from grading papers. I thought it was just him being him. But now I know the truth. That smile wasn't for the lake. It was for her. Kate was in that photo too. I hadn't noticed it at the time. She was standing at the edge of the frame, tucked behind someone else. But now that I know, I can see the way she was angled toward him, the way her body leaned, the way they were both looking at something off camera, something that wasn't the sunset. I heard the shower turn off upstairs. My body reacted before my brain did. I locked the phone screen and put it face down on the counter, as if that could undo what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I took a breath. Then another. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, someone playing a cruel joke, maybe one of the students he'd failed, out for revenge. But I knew better. I've always known better. That's the worst part about being a person who pays attention. You can't unsee the details once they've been assembled. The phone had a local area code. The number wasn't blocked, and whoever sent it knew enough to include a screenshot with Kate's name clearly visible. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Someone wanted me to know. And the terrifying thing was, as I stood there trying to process it, the only emotion I could identify wasn't sadness or rage. It was relief. A tiny, shameful flicker of relief that I finally had an explanation for the distance I'd been feeling, the way Mark had stopped reaching for me in the middle of the night, the way he'd pull away when I tried to kiss him.
The way he looked at his phone like it was a secret he was protecting. I had been telling myself it was stress, work, life, the normal ebb and flow of a long marriage. But it wasn't normal. It was never normal. It was just a slow, quiet fading that I chose to ignore because the alternative was too terrifying to face. He came down the stairs a few minutes later, still buttoning his shirt, his hair damp and smelling like the expensive cologne I bought him for his birthday. He smiled at me, that same smile I'd fallen in love with 15 years ago. It was crooked and warm, and it usually made my heart feel like it was melting. But this time, all I could see was the lie behind it. All I could see was the way his eyes flickered to my phone on the counter just for a second before looking back at me. He asked if I'd slept okay. He kissed my forehead. He poured himself a cup of coffee and told me about the lesson plan he was working on. His voice was steady. His hands were steady. He was so calm, so perfectly ordinary, that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But the photo was still on my phone. The words were still burned into my retina. I miss your voice. I can't stop thinking about Saturday. I didn't confront him. I couldn't. My voice didn't feel like my own. My mouth was dry and my hands were clammy, and the only thing I could do was nod along as he talked about colonialism and primary sources and the essay he was going to assign. I watched him eat his toast. I watched him check his watch. I watched him say goodbye and walk out the front door with his messenger bag slung over his shoulder. And I didn't stop him. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and a phone full of secrets. And I realized that the life I thought I had was already over. It ended 3 Saturdays ago at a lake house I'd never been to, with a sunset I'd never seen. I just didn't know it yet. And neither did he. Not really.
Because he was still walking out the door, still thinking he was getting away with it.
still believing that his wife was the same trusting woman who'd never once checked his phone in 12 years of marriage. He didn't know that the floor had already fallen away. He didn't know that I was already plummeting. The rest of that day passed in a fog. I went to work, I sat through meetings, I smiled at my colleagues and answered emails and performed the basic functions of a human being. But I wasn't there. Not really. I was still standing in that kitchen, watching the crack in the tile, wondering how many other cracks I'd missed. I spent the evening in our bedroom, scrolling through old photos on my phone, looking for signs I'd overlooked. A missed call, a strange look, a moment when his attention had drifted somewhere I couldn't follow. I found nothing and everything. I found the normal texture of a marriage that had been slowly eroding without my permission. And then I found myself typing the number from that text into my phone. I wanted to know who it was. I wanted to know if it was Kate herself, or someone else, or just a stranger who'd stumbled onto the truth. But I didn't send anything. I just stared at the cursor blinking on the screen, daring me to move forward. By the time Mark came home that night, I had decided to wait. I told myself I needed more proof. I told myself I needed to be sure. But really, I was just afraid. Afraid of what I'd lose. Afraid of what I'd have to admit. That my husband, my best friend, the man I trusted with every part of myself, had been lying to me for months. And I'd let him. I'd let him because I didn't want to see what was right in front of my face. That's the cruelest part of the whole thing. Not the cheating, not the lies. It's the way you betray yourself first, long before anyone else gets the chance. I didn't sleep that night.
I lay next to Mark in the bed we'd shared for over a decade, my back turned to him, my eyes wide open in the dark. The sound of his breathing was steady and slow, the same rhythm I'd fallen asleep to for thousands of nights. It used to comfort me. It used to be the sound of safety, of home, of everything that was right in my world. His chest rising and falling without a single tremor of guilt, while I stared at the ceiling and replayed every text I'd read that morning. I wanted to wake him up. I wanted to shake him and scream and demand answers. But I didn't. I just lay there, frozen, my mind spinning through possibilities I couldn't bear to fully articulate. The silence of the room was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling and the distant hum of the furnace kicking on. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, that presses down on your chest until you forget how to breathe properly. I counted the hours until dawn. I counted the minutes. I counted the seconds, watching the red numbers on the alarm clock bleed from midnight to 1, from 1 to 2, each digit a small death I couldn't stop. When the first gray light started seeping through the blinds, I made a decision. I was going to find out everything, not just the texts, not just the lake house weekend. I needed to know the full shape of it, the geography of the betrayal, the timeline of every lie he told me. It wasn't masochism, it was survival. Because the thing nobody tells you about discovering infidelity is that your brain starts filling in the blanks on its own, and the blanks are always worse than the truth. I needed to replace the horror of my imagination with facts. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with.
So I waited until Mark left for work, kissing me on the forehead the way he always did, telling me he'd be home by 6, that he was thinking of ordering takeout from that Thai place I liked. I smiled and said that sounded great. I told him to have a good day. I watched him drive away from the window, the tail lights of his sedan disappearing around the corner, and then I went straight to his home office. The office was the one room in the house I rarely entered. It was Mark's domain, cluttered with textbooks and old lesson plans, and a filing cabinet that was always half open. There were framed photos on the desk, from our wedding, from vacations, from a time when I believed every picture told the truth. I sat in his chair and opened his laptop. I knew his password. It was our anniversary. Pathetic, I know. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd never changed it because he never thought I'd look. He never thought I'd have a reason to. I opened his email first, scrolling through the usual clutter of student assignments and staff announcements and spam from retailers he'd bought one thing from years ago. But then I found a folder labeled Personal. Inside were emails to Kate, dozens of them, stretching back over 8 months, all the way to February. The first ones were innocent, friendly, professional, but the tone shifted around April. There was a dinner invitation that was phrased as a work event but clearly wasn't. There was a chain about a conference they'd both attended, and then a thread about a hike they'd taken together on a Saturday I thought he'd spent grading papers. Each email was more intimate than the last. They talked about their marriages. They talked about their unhappiness. They talked about feeling invisible. I felt my stomach lurch as I read the words I'd been dreading. I feel like I've been asleep my whole life. That was from Mark. And her reply, I know exactly what you mean.
You wake up one day and realize you've been going through the motions with the wrong person. I closed the laptop. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls tilting inward, the ceiling dropping lower with each ragged breath I took. I put my head between my knees and tried to remember how to regulate my own body. The wrong person. That was how he saw me. After 15 years, after every argument we'd survived, every laugh we'd shared, every quiet Sunday morning on the couch with coffee and the newspaper, I was just the wrong person he'd settled for. I was the placeholder, the obligation, the woman he was going through the motions with while he waited for someone who made him feel awake. The pain was physical. It radiated from my chest down to my stomach, a deep, hollow ache that made me want to curl into a ball and disappear. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I forced myself to sit up straight and open the laptop again. I wasn't finished. I needed to see the rest of it, the full scope of the damage, even if it destroyed me. I found photos next. Pictures Mark had taken on his phone and uploaded to his cloud drive. Pictures of Kate. At the lake house, wearing a red bikini that made my blood run cold. At a restaurant I'd never seen before, candles flickering in the background. Her face lit up in a smile I could only describe as intimate. There were selfies of the two of them together, his arm around her shoulder, both of them laughing at something off camera. I studied every detail. The way her hand rested on his chest, the way his eyes looked at her, softer than I'd seen them look at me in years. There was one photo that broke something fundamental inside me. It was a picture of his hand holding hers over a table, the angle clearly taken by someone else, a third party who'd known exactly what they were documenting. There was a ring on her finger, an engagement ring. Not from Mark, obviously. She was married too. I'd known that.
Mark had mentioned her husband once, a guy named something boring like Eric or Evan, someone who worked in finance and traveled a lot. But I hadn't thought about what that meant. I hadn't thought about the fact that two people were destroying two marriages, not just one. I hadn't thought about the domino effect of it all, the way this betrayal was reverberating outward, touching lives I'd never even met. I spent the rest of that morning in a trance. I went through Mark's social media, his text messages, his call logs. I even went through his calendar, cross-referencing every evening he'd worked late, every weekend he'd had a commitment, every time he told me he needed space or time to himself. The pattern was undeniable. He'd been building this other life for almost a year. He'd been lying to me for months, and I'd been too busy trusting him to notice. I felt like an idiot. I felt like the kind of woman I'd always pitied in movies and books, the one who doesn't see what's right in front of her because she's too desperate to believe in the fairy tale. But I wasn't desperate. I wasn't naive. I was just in love. And love, I was learning, is the most effective blindfold there is. Around noon, I realized I hadn't eaten. I hadn't drunk anything. My body felt foreign, disconnected, like I was watching myself from a great distance. I walked to the kitchen on autopilot and opened the refrigerator, staring at the shelves without really seeing anything. The eggs were where they always were, the leftover pasta from 2 nights ago, the bottle of white wine I'd been saving for a weekend we never ended up having. I closed the door and leaned against it, my forehead pressed against the cold stainless steel, and I let myself cry for the first time. It wasn't the dramatic sobbing you see in movies. It was quiet and ugly, the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep you didn't know it existed until it cracked open. I cried for the life I thought I had.
I cried for the future I'd imagined, the one where Mark and I grew old together on a porch somewhere, complaining about our neighbors and spoiling our grandkids. I cried for the version of myself that still believed in happy endings, because that version was gone now, and I didn't know who would replace her. But somewhere in the middle of that ugly, gasping cry, something shifted. The grief started to crystallize into something harder. Anger. Cold and sharp and righteous. The kind of anger that doesn't scream or break things, but sits in the pit of your stomach and burns slowly, quietly, waiting for the right moment to strike. I wasn't going to fall apart. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me broken. He'd taken enough from me already. He'd taken my trust, my peace of mind, my belief in the integrity of our marriage. He was not going to take my dignity too. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and went back to his office. I opened his laptop one more time and started making copies of everything. I sent the screenshots to my own email. I saved the photos to a secure folder. I documented every piece of evidence I could find, building a case I didn't yet know what to do with. It felt clinical, surgical, like I was performing an autopsy on my own marriage, cataloging each wound so I could understand how the heart had stopped beating. That evening, Mark came home at 6:15, exactly 15 minutes later than he'd said he would. He blamed traffic. I nodded and said nothing. He kissed me on the cheek and asked if I'd ordered the Thai food. I said I hadn't, that I'd lost track of time. He laughed and said it was fine, he'd order it now. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through the delivery app, completely unaware that his entire life was about to shift on its axis.
I watched him from the kitchen island, studying the curve of his jaw, the way his fingers moved across the screen, the slight furrow in his brow as he concentrated on finding the right menu. He looked exactly the same as he always had, and yet he was a stranger. A stranger wearing my husband's skin, speaking in my husband's voice, touching me with hands that had touched someone else. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to look at him and feel nothing but disgust. But underneath the anger, underneath the betrayal, there was still love. A stubborn, pathetic, deeply human love that refused to die even as he was stabbing it in the chest. I hated myself for that. I hated the part of me that still wanted to forgive him, that still wanted to believe there was an explanation, a way to go back to the way things were. He asked me about my day. I told him about a meeting I'd had, a project I was working on, the usual small talk that filled the spaces of our evening routine. My voice was steady. My hands were steady. I was performing the role of the oblivious wife, and I was doing it so well that even I almost believed it. But I wasn't oblivious. I wasn't anything close to oblivious. I was watching him with new eyes, seeing all the small tells I'd missed before. The way he checked his phone under the table, the way he smiled at something on the screen before quickly looking away, the way his answers were just slightly too short, too vague, too careful. He was hiding. He'd been hiding for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be honest. And I, in turn, was hiding too. We were both playing our parts, both wearing masks, both pretending that the walls around us weren't crumbling to dust. The Thai food arrived. We ate in front of the TV. We watched a crime show about a husband who killed his wife for the insurance money. Mark laughed at something the detective said. I barely heard a word.
My mind was somewhere else entirely, running through scenarios like a film projector stuck on a single frame. I didn't confront him that night either. I wasn't ready. The anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, but the shock was still too fresh. I needed time to process. I needed to figure out what I actually wanted, what my end game was. Did I want to save the marriage? Did I want to leave? Did I want to make him suffer the way I was suffering? I didn't have the answers yet. All I had was the weight of the truth pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating, a secret I was now carrying alone. And the cruelest part was, he didn't even know I knew. He went to bed that night with a clear conscience, still believing he'd gotten away with it, still believing his wife was too trusting to ever suspect a thing. He was wrong. I knew everything, and the silence I was holding was more powerful than any accusation I could have screamed at him. It was the silence of a woman who was gathering her strength. It was the silence of a woman who was waiting for the right moment to strike. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I went through every motion of my daily routine, like an actress in a play I no longer believed in. I woke up,
I made coffee, I went to work, I came home, I made dinner, I watched TV, I went to bed. But inside, I was a churning storm of conflicting emotions. The anger was still there, cold and constant, but it had been joined by something else, something uglier. Doubt. Not doubt about what he'd done, the evidence was undeniable, but doubt about myself, about whether I'd somehow driven him to it, about whether I'd been a bad wife, a neglectful partner, someone who'd made it easy for him to look elsewhere. I know that's the classic victim response, the way betrayed women are conditioned to blame themselves. But knowing that didn't make the feeling any less real.
I replayed every argument we'd ever had, every time I'd been too tired for sex, every time I'd chosen work over date night, every moment of irritation or impatience I'd ever shown him. I cataloged my flaws like exhibits in a courtroom, trying to understand how I'd failed so completely. And the worst part was, there were kernels of truth in there. I hadn't been perfect. I'd been distracted, stressed, overwhelmed by the mundane demands of adult life. I'd stopped looking at him the way I used to, stopped reaching for him in the dark, stopped making him feel like he was the center of my world. I'd assumed we were secure enough to coast. I'd assumed love didn't require constant maintenance. I'd assumed wrong. But no matter how much I tortured myself with self-criticism, I always came back to the same conclusion. Even if I'd been a terrible wife, and I wasn't, not really, it didn't excuse what he'd done. There were 1,000 ways to address unhappiness in a marriage. You could talk, you could go to therapy, you could ask for a separation, you could leave. But you didn't get to build a secret life with someone else while your wife was still at home, still cooking your dinners, still folding your laundry, still believing in the vows you'd made to each other. That was a choice, a deliberate, selfish, cowardly choice. And every time I remembered that, the anger surged back stronger than before. I started watching him more closely. Not the way I used to watch him, with affection and familiarity, but the way a detective watches a suspect. I noted every inconsistency in his stories, every time his phone buzzed and he angled it away from me, every time he said he was going to the gym and came home smelling like shower soap instead of sweat. I was building a mental map of his lies, cataloging each one like a collector adding to a growing collection. And there were so many of them. So many small deceptions that I would have ignored before, explanations I would have accepted without question, that now stood out like red flags in a sea of white. He said he had a staff meeting on a Thursday. I checked his calendar. There was no staff meeting. He said he was going to help his brother move furniture on a Saturday. I called his brother to confirm a dinner plan I'd already known wasn't happening, and his brother had no idea what I was talking about. He said he was exhausted and needed to sleep early. I heard him on the phone in the bathroom at midnight, his voice low and intimate, saying words I couldn't quite make out but could feel in my bones were meant for someone else. The hardest part was pretending I didn't know. Every time he touched me, I had to fight the urge to flinch. Every time he said he loved me, I had to stop myself from laughing in his face. I was living a lie within a lie, and the weight of it was crushing me. I started sleeping on the edge of the bed, as far from him as I could get without falling off. I started avoiding his gaze because I was terrified that if I looked at him too long, he'd see the truth in my eyes. But he didn't see anything. He was too absorbed in his own secret world to notice that his wife had become a ghost in her own life. And that made me angrier than anything else. The sheer arrogance of it. The assumption that I was too stupid, too blind, too complacent to ever figure it out. He'd underestimated me, and that was going to be his mistake. I decided to meet Kate, not confront her, not yet, but just see her, watch her, try to understand what she had that I didn't. It was a dangerous impulse, I knew that. It was the kind of thing that could backfire spectacularly, could tip my hand before I was ready to play it. But the curiosity was unbearable. I needed to put a face to the name that had been haunting my dreams.
So I found her on social media, a profile she'd kept semi-public, filled with photos of her own suburban life. She was pretty in a polished, put-together way. Blonde highlights, expensive jeans, the kind of effortless style that takes hours to achieve. She had 2 kids, a boy and a girl,
both smiling in every picture like they'd never known a moment of sadness. She had a golden retriever and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. She had a life that looked, from the outside, just as ordinary and content as mine had once seemed. And yet, she decided to risk it all. She decided that her husband, her children, her home, none of it was worth protecting compared to the thrill of being wanted by someone else's husband. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't fathom how anyone could look at their family and decide that a secret affair was worth destroying everything. But then again, I couldn't fathom how Mark had done the same thing. That was the thread that connected us, the three of us. We were all capable of choices I'd never thought I'd make. I was just the only one who hadn't known it yet. I drove to her neighborhood one afternoon after work. It was a quiet suburb about 20 minutes from ours, filled with identical houses and manicured lawns, and the kind of stillness that felt suffocating rather than peaceful. I parked across the street from her house and just sat there, watching. It was grotesque, I knew. It was the behavior of a stalker, someone who'd lost all sense of proportion. But I couldn't stop myself. I needed to see her in her natural habitat, to understand how she moved through the world, to catch a glimpse of the woman my husband had chosen over me. After about 15 minutes, she came out the front door. She was wearing yoga pants and a loose sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun that looked intentional. She was talking on the phone, laughing at something the person on the other end had said.
And then she walked to her car and got in and drove away, completely unaware that she'd been observed. I felt nothing. Not rage, not jealousy, not sadness, just a hollow emptiness that was somehow worse than all of them. She was just a person, a flawed, ordinary person who'd made a terrible choice. And so was Mark. And so, now, was I. I was choosing to stay silent. I was choosing to play this game instead of walking away. I was choosing revenge over healing, and I wasn't sure which of us was more wrong. The confrontation came on a Friday night. I hadn't planned it. I'd been planning to wait longer, to gather more evidence, to be fully prepared for whatever came next. But the secret had grown too heavy inside me. It was poisoning everything, seeping into every interaction, making it impossible to look at him without feeling like I was going to choke. We were sitting on the couch, watching some show I couldn't follow, when he reached over and took my hand. It was such a casual gesture, so automatic, that it broke something loose inside me. I pulled my hand away. He looked at me, confused. He asked what was wrong, and I just started talking. The words came out in a flood, unstoppable and raw, all the anger and hurt and disgust I'd been holding back for weeks. I told him I knew about Kate. I told him I'd seen the texts, the emails, the photos. I told him I'd been watching him lie to me every single day, and that I was done pretending. I told him he'd destroyed everything we'd built, and that there was no coming back from it. He was silent for a long moment. His face went pale, then red, then pale again. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then, instead of denying it, instead of apologizing, he said the one thing that made me see him clearly for the first time. He said, "It's not what you think." I almost laughed. It was the most cliché, pathetic response he could have given, but I didn't laugh. I just stared at him, waiting, and he started talking.
He told me he'd been unhappy for years. He told me he felt invisible in our marriage, like he was just a fixture in the background of my life. He told me Kate made him feel seen, made him feel alive, made him feel like a person instead of a role. He said he never meant to hurt me. He said he was sorry. He said all the things people say when they've been caught, the same tired justifications I'd heard 1,000 times in movies and books and whispered confessions from friends. But hearing them from him, in his voice, with his face contorted in a mask of regret, was a different kind of devastation. It wasn't the cheating that broke me in that moment. It was the truth behind it. He really had been unhappy. He really had felt unseen. And I really had failed to notice. Not because I was selfish or neglectful, but because I'd assumed he would tell me. I'd assumed that if something was wrong, he'd speak up. I'd assumed our communication was strong enough to weather any storm. I'd assumed wrong. He cried. I'd never seen him cry before. Not really. Not like this. He buried his face in his hands and his shoulders shook, and he made sounds I didn't recognize as coming from him. And I sat there, frozen, watching the man I'd loved for 15 years fall apart in front of me. Part of me wanted to comfort him. Part of me wanted to scream.
Part of me just wanted to walk out the door and never look back. But I stayed. I stayed because I needed to hear everything. I needed to know the full extent of it, even if it destroyed me. And so I asked him the question that had been burning in my chest since the first text. I asked him if he loved her. He looked at me with wet eyes and a trembling jaw, and he told me the truth. He said he didn't know. He said he thought he did, but he didn't know what love was anymore, didn't know if he'd ever really known. And that answer, that pathetic, cowardly non-answer, told me everything I needed to know. He was lost. He'd been lost for a long time, and instead of finding his way back to me, he'd let himself get lost in someone else. And now there was no map back. There was no path home. There was just the wreckage of everything we'd been and the uncertain future of everything we'd never be. I didn't yell. I didn't throw things. I didn't storm out. I just sat there, numb, processing the confession I'd been dreading and needing in equal measure. And when he finished talking, when he'd run out of excuses and explanations and apologies, I said the only thing I could. I told him I needed space. I told him I needed to think. I told him to pack a bag and go stay with his brother, or with a friend, or with Kate for all I cared. But I couldn't have him in this house anymore. Not tonight. Not until I figured out what I wanted. He didn't argue. He just nodded, wiped his eyes, and went upstairs to pack. I listened to the sound of him moving around our bedroom, opening drawers, closing closet doors, and I felt like I was watching my own life from the outside. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't the life I'd imagined. And yet, here I was, sitting in the living room of the house we'd bought together, waiting for him to leave so I could finally start the long, painful process of figuring out who I was without him. He left an hour later. He stood in the doorway, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and he looked at me with eyes that were red and swollen and full of something I couldn't identify. He asked if I was going to be okay. I said I didn't know. He said he'd call in the morning. I said okay. And then he walked out the door, and I locked it behind him, and I listened to his car start and drive away, the sound fading into the quiet of a Friday night that suddenly felt like the loneliest night in my entire life. I didn't cry. I didn't break anything. I just walked back to the living room, sat down on the couch, and stared at the blank TV screen until the sun came up.
Because that was the thing about secrets. Once they were out, they didn't make anything easier. They just made everything real. The house felt different after he left. It wasn't just the absence of his physical presence, the empty side of the bed, the silent bathroom, the coffee maker that only brewed one cup now. It was the absence of the lie. For months, I'd been living inside a fiction, a carefully constructed story about a happy marriage that had been slowly unraveling without my knowledge. And now that the truth was out, the fiction had collapsed, and I was left standing in the rubble, trying to figure out which pieces were real and which had always been part of the performance. The first few days were a blur of numbness and survival. I went to work because I didn't know what else to do. I answered emails and attended meetings and smiled at my colleagues, all while feeling like I was floating somewhere above my own body, watching myself go through the motions of a life I no longer recognized. At night, I'd come home to the empty house and just sit in the silence, letting it wash over me. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't listen to music. I just sat there, in the dark, trying to feel something other than the hollow ache that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. But eventually, the numbness started to fade, and the real work began. I started therapy. I'd always been skeptical of it, the kind of person who thought you should be able to handle your own problems without paying someone to listen. But I was drowning, and I needed a lifeline. My therapist was a woman named Diane, about 60, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that I appreciated. She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't offer easy answers. She just asked questions, probing the edges of my pain until I started to understand its shape. She helped me see that my anger at Mark was justified, but that my anger at myself was not. She helped me untangle the knot of guilt and shame and self-blame that had been strangling me since the moment I'd first seen those texts. She helped me understand that his choices were his own, that they had nothing to do with my worth as a woman or a wife, and that I'd been carrying a burden that was never mine to carry. It sounds simple when you say it out loud, but internalizing it, truly believing it, was a different story. It took weeks of sitting in that office, crying and yelling and sitting in uncomfortable silences before I started to feel the weight lift even a little. Mark called. He called a lot, actually. At first, I didn't answer. I wasn't ready. I needed space, and he needed to respect that. But eventually, I started picking up because I realized that running from the conversation wasn't going to make it go away. We needed to figure out what came next, even if what came next was the end. He apologized over and over again. The same words, the same tears, the same desperate plea for another chance. He told me he'd ended things with Kate. He told me he'd started seeing a therapist himself. He told me he was willing to do whatever it took to rebuild my trust, even if it took years. And part of me wanted to believe him. Part of me still loved him, still remembered the man he'd been before all of this, still held on to the hope that we could find our way back to each other. But there was another part of me, a louder part, that couldn't forget what I'd seen. The texts, the photos, the way he'd looked at her in that picture, softer than he'd looked at me in years. That image was burned into my brain, and no amount of apology could erase it. I decided to meet Kate, not the way I'd watched her from my car, but face to face, like two adults. I needed to see her without the filter of my own rage, to understand who she was and what had happened between them. It was a risky move, and my therapist warned me against it.
But I'd spent too long being passive, too long letting things happen to me instead of taking control. This was my choice, my decision. I texted her from a burner number I'd set up, telling her who I was and asking if she'd be willing to meet. She responded within an hour, her reply full of hesitation and fear, and something that almost sounded like relief. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our houses, neutral ground where neither of us would have the advantage. When I walked in, she was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. She looked smaller than I'd expected, less polished, more human. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair limp, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around the cup. She looked like someone who'd been through hell. And I realized, with a jolt of something I couldn't name, that she had. She'd lost her marriage, too. Her husband had found out about the affair and had kicked her out. Her kids were with him, and she was staying in a cramped apartment on the other side of town, trying to figure out how to rebuild a life she'd torn apart with her own hands. We talked for 2 hours. It was one of the strangest conversations I've ever had, intimate and adversarial all at once. She told me about her marriage, the years of loneliness, the feeling of being unseen by a husband who was always traveling for work. She told me about meeting Mark at a school function, the way he'd made her laugh, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only person in the room. She told me she knew it was wrong, knew it was destructive, but she couldn't stop. She said it was like an addiction, the feeling of being wanted, of being seen, and she'd convinced herself that no one was getting hurt. I listened to all of it, the justifications and the apologies, and the messy, complicated truth of two flawed people who'd made terrible choices. And when she was done, I told her my side.
I told her about the life I thought I'd had, the trust I'd given so freely, the moment I'd found out and felt my entire world collapse. I told her about the anger and the grief and the long, dark nights where I'd questioned everything about myself. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse, I just spoke the truth, letting her see the full cost of what they'd done. By the end, we were both crying. Not dramatic sobs, but quiet, exhausted tears that seemed to drain the last of the tension out of the room. She reached across the table and took my hand. She said she was sorry, not the perfunctory apology of someone who's been caught, but a real, gut-level sorrow that I could feel in my bones. And I believed her. I didn't forgive her, not fully, not yet, but I believed her. That meeting changed something in me. It humanized her in a way I hadn't expected. She wasn't a villain, wasn't a seductress, wasn't the evil other woman I'd constructed in my mind. She was just a person, as broken and lost as I was, who'd made a terrible mistake and was paying for it every single day. And if I could see her that way, could see the complexity and nuance of her situation, then maybe I could see Mark that way too, not as a monster, but as a flawed man who'd lost his way. That didn't excuse what he'd done. It didn't make it okay, but it made it understandable in a way that allowed me to start letting go of the rage that had been consuming me. Over the next few months, Mark and I started meeting regularly, not as a couple trying to reconcile, but as two people trying to figure out what came next. We went to joint therapy sessions, painful and raw, where we laid out everything we'd been too afraid to say to each other for years. We talked about the distance that had grown between us, the ways we'd both checked out of the marriage without realizing it. We talked about the children we'd never had and the grief we'd never fully processed, and the way that grief had built a wall between us that we'd both been too scared to tear down. We talked about the future and what it might look like, and whether there was any version of it that included both of us. It wasn't easy. There were moments where I wanted to walk out, where the pain was too fresh, where the memories were too vivid. But there were also moments of connection, moments where I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, the man who made me laugh and held me when I cried and looked at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Those moments were fleeting, but they were real, and they made me wonder if maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The decision came on a rainy Sunday in March. I was sitting in the living room of our house, the house we'd built together, the house that held 15 years of memories. Mark was across from me, his hands clasped in his lap, his eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't sure I had. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, weighing the pros and cons, trying to separate what I wanted from what I thought I should want. And in that moment, I realized there was no right answer. There was just the choice I had to make, and the life I had to live with the consequences. I told him I wasn't ready to move back in together. I told him I needed more time, more space, more certainty that he changed. But I also told him I wasn't closing the door. I told him I still loved him, still believed in the possibility of us, even after everything. I told him I wanted to try, not to go back to the way things were, because that was impossible, but to build something new, something honest, something that acknowledged the pain and the betrayal, and still chose to move forward anyway. He cried when I said that. He cried like he hadn't cried since that night he'd left, his shoulders shaking, his voice breaking as he told me he didn't deserve me. I didn't disagree, but I told him that love wasn't about deserving. It was about choosing. And in that moment, I chose to give us one more chance. It's been 2 years since that rainy Sunday. We're not the same people we were before the affair. We'll never be those people again. But we've built something new, something that's stronger in some ways and weaker in others. There are days when the trust feels fragile, when a late night at work or a phone call taken in another room sends a chill down my spine. But there are also days when I look at him and feel the old warmth, the old love, the old connection that made me fall for him in the first place. We're in couples therapy. We're in individual therapy. We talk more honestly than we ever did before, even when it's uncomfortable. We've learned that love isn't a destination, it's a practice, a daily choice to show up for each other even when it's hard. I still think about Kate sometimes. I still think about the texts, the photos, the betrayal. But the sharp edges have worn down over time, replaced by a dull ache that I've learned to live with. Forgiveness, I've realized, isn't a single moment. It's a process, a long and winding road that never truly ends. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the complexity, the messiness, the imperfection of it all. Because that's what it means to be human. That's what it means to love. The truth that was hidden for 10 years finally came out, and instead of destroying me, it set me free. Not free from the pain, not free from the memories, but free from the illusion, free from the lie I'd been telling myself about my marriage, about my husband, about myself. I see things clearly now, without the rose-colored glasses I'd been wearing for so long, and even though the clarity is sometimes painful, it's also a gift. Because now I know exactly who I am, what I want, and what I'm willing to fight for. I chose to fight for us, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. And in the end, that's all any of us can do. We can't control the choices other people make. We can only control our own. And I chose to love, even when it hurt. I chose to stay, even when leaving would have been easier. I chose to believe in the possibility of redemption, not for Mark, but for myself. Because I deserved to believe that people could change, that love could survive, that hope wasn't just a naive fantasy. And maybe that's the real truth, the one that matters most, that the only way through the darkness is to keep walking, keep fighting, keep believing that the light is still there, even when you can't see it. That's what I learned. That's what I'll carry with me, always.